When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled, Will AI Replace Us? With the creator of TabNine and Supermaven, Jacob Jackson. So in this interview episode, we're going to be discussing with Jacob Jackson a whole bunch of things, which I will divulge in just a few moments. But if this episode sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And just a reminder that we do have a Scrimba affiliate link if you want to go and check that out within the show description or on htmlallthethings.com. Go check that out. So our guest today, as the title suggested, is Jacob Jackson, an influential figure in the world of AI. Jacob is the creator of TabNine, the first widely deployed code completion tool to use deep learning. He also used to work at OpenAI, but these days, Jacob is working on Supermaven. Supermaven is an AI coding copilot that can help you write code 2 times faster. We'll be diving into the basics of LLMs, discuss whether AI will replace us, Skynet anybody, and of course, we'll be asking questions about Supermaven and more. So let's cut to this loaded interview right now. Alrighty, everybody, we have Jacob on the line here. And before we jump into this loaded episode, Jacob, what's up? What's going on? How you been doing? And what have you been working on?
Hey, I've been doing good. Super happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, Mike. I've been working on Supermaven. We're an alternative to GitHub Copilot, and I've just been really working on building that product and trying to make it faster the past couple of months.
That's awesome. Yeah. And just some context for everyone. I think Jacob and I connected because I made a post on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, complimenting Supermaven because I kind of made a switch from Copilot to Supermaven. They're both autocomplete, AI systems inside your code editors, VS Code for me. And I was kind of super impressed with this little scrappy startup, from what it seems, that was able to completely dethrone Copilot for me in a matter of like hours after using it. And I've been a Copilot user since beta, like really early on. And yeah, so I made that post. Jacob reached out. We had a little quick chat about what I like and stuff like that. And I asked him to come on the podcast. So again, Jacob, really appreciate you taking your time. I know you have probably not a lot of time with all the stuff you have going on, but I wanted to kind of give a chance for you to describe some stuff about where the AI landscape is right now, and then for us to dive into kind of the big topic question, the question that's on everyone's mind: will AI replace us? But that's going to be later on in the episode, just for everyone. For now, Jacob, if you could give it just a short description, just for anyone that's kind of coming in fresh into the web development space. What's an LLM? Like a large language model, what is it, and maybe how does it fit in right now, specifically with programming?
Sure. Yeah, an LLM. So the most well-known example of an LLM is probably ChatGPT. LLM is a machine learning model that's been trained on a whole bunch of internet text to try and predict the next word. So it'll be trained on text, it'll be trained on code. People will scrape the whole internet. They'll give it a web page. They'll give it the amount, the text you've seen up until a certain point, and then they'll say, what do you think comes next? And this is actually like a very subtle and challenging problem. And when you get a model that is good at that problem, it's useful for all sorts of things, including writing essays and indeed writing code. So lots of people use ChatGPT to write code because it's just acquired all this knowledge from the internet. And so LLM is the technology that makes that possible.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that kind of summarizes it perfectly for everyone. And in your view, what are the current LLM models good at, right? Like I know it's not like a solution for everything. Everyone's saying that we're waiting for the next one and stuff like that, but they are good at stuff. Like I use it every day essentially. But what do you think they're particularly good at right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're just amazingly good at everything compared to anything that came before. If you're getting into this recently, you might not understand that there's like dozens of things that LLMs can do effortlessly today that used to be not just like open problems, but like whole subfields of machine learning, right? One example is this challenge, like the Winograd schema challenge. This used to be a challenge that people would write papers about and submit solutions to. And what this challenge was is you would just give the system a sentence. So an example sentence is like the city councilman refused the demonstrators a permit because they feared violence. And then what you do is you ask the model, hey, what does the word they refer to in that sentence? And it's like, okay, well, they feared violence. Okay, that has to be the councilman, not the demonstrators, right? But then you switch it around. You say, okay, what about the sentence? The city councilman refused the demonstrators a permit because they advocated violence. Okay, in that situation, has to be the demonstrators, right? Because that's who would be logically advocating violence in that situation. And you give this to someone today, they're like, well, I can just type that into ChatGPT, right? What's the big deal? But this used to be like an open problem. There were like professors who would study this problem, and so the modern LLMs have really just sort of cut through whole subfields and just like mastered a lot of stuff that people thought were like 20 years away.
What would you say to people that are using LLMs? Because like what Mike said, we might be talking to some people that are fresh on it. And I'm finding a lot of my friends and people that are using it, whether they're programmers or not, they're not getting into these like sort of high tech problems, if you will. And they're just sort of using it almost like a graduated like Amazon Echo or like a Google Assistant. And so they're already at the point where they're kind of saying, and it's almost a meme at this point, where they're saying, this is just a big drop down list, right? This is just a big if statement. All this thing does is sort of parrot what we've told it. It just reads blog posts and just sort of understands context a bit more. So it's just a big if statement. What would you say to sort of combat that? Because, obviously these larger problems like you're mentioning are much more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're just practically useful for a lot of stuff that they wouldn't be if they were just a big if statement. For example, if you have some code, you can just put the code in and you can ask the model, hey, can you explain what this code does? And it'll usually do a pretty good job. If you have some code and you want to make a little change to it, you can just paste that in. You can say, hey, I want to make this change. And it doesn't always get it right. But the attempts it makes, you can tell, it understands the code at some level. And it's useful for a lot of these tasks that it wouldn't be if it were just memorizing.
Just from a use case side, if you treat it like a drop-down menu, it could act like a drop-down menu. You know what I mean? Like it could act like an if statement if you don't understand its capabilities, right? Yeah. If you think that it can only do these things and you limit it, like by asking a very limiting question, it will spit out that's the thing that you're expecting it to spit out, and then you'll be like, oh, look at it, it's only an if statement. But the reality is that you're just prompting it wrong. You're just using the tool in the incorrect way. Yeah.
And it's great at that sort of thing. If you're looking for some information where there's a lot of, spam online, you click the link, you're going to get a bunch of ads, right? Then LLM, great alternative to that. But, it can be so much more.
What do you think about the idea that, from the consumer's perspective? So the consumer perspective is obviously they're using things like Copilot on Windows and the Microsoft suite of apps. Maybe they're using Gemini, those type of things. What do you think about the consumer angle? Where I've been asked by friends, why hasn't our smart home tech been taken over by LLMs? Why aren't LLMs on smart speakers? Why hasn't these things taken over? And they use that as a way to say this tech is just like a fad. It's going to go away, or it'll hit a plateau. Like maybe it's, growing quickly now, but it'll grow to 10%. I'm just throwing some random numbers in there, but it'll grow to 10% of the potential that we think it can have in totality. And then it'll just plateau for years. We'll get stuck on something. What do you think of it in terms of that sort of consumer angle?
I think we're still very early. ChatGPT was late 2022. We're maybe like a year and a half into it. And, there's enormous appetite to adopt this technology across industries, because people are always on the lookout for new things to work on and integrate. I think when you look at smart speakers and stuff like that, stuff that's more on the hardware side, those things have longer release cycles. And so it'll take longer for something to actually hit the market there. But I think it's definitely happening. And there's just enormous buy-in, like throughout any kind of tech company. You tell people, oh, we need to be using LLMs more. And, from leadership, you'll get a lot of people saying, I totally agree. So I think it's going to happen.
Do you think that it has anything to do with, and maybe not, because current smart speakers largely still rely on the cloud. If there's no Wi-Fi, all it'll say to you is, please connect me to Wi-Fi, I can't respond to you, kind of thing in most cases. But I do know that Apple, or my one friend, he's really into Apple stuff, and he's been sending me a collection of articles and rumors and a whole bunch of stuff where Apple is allegedly, whether it's confirmed or not, working on-device LLM, on-device AI. Do you think that that's going to possibly help the hardware angle? Do you think that we're going to start getting off of the cloud a bit with this tech, or is it still going to be largely connected to the cloud, even like with our, I guess, dumb assistants now that we currently have with current gen smart speakers? I
think there are definitely going to be more on-device LLMs, and yeah, I think Apple is super interested in this. You see with the recent Mac laptops and phones, they have custom hardware and support for this kind of thing. One thing with these LLMs is they are very expensive to run, right? It costs a lot of money for the hardware and the power to provide these services. So one drawback of a local LLM is that, it's only using that very expensive hardware when you're asking a question. So it's more economical to run this stuff in the cloud because the hardware is so expensive. And that way you can sort of just share the hardware across a bunch of different people. But, also for privacy and latency reasons, the on-device models are also going to be big, but they maybe won't be quite as large or as smart as what you would get in the cloud.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think we're still a little bit away from seeing like a GPT-4 on a MacBook Air kind of thing running.
Yeah, and we'll get there, but it might be a while.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've talked about like where the LLM models are good, what they're capable of, but I think we're not at the end game yet. Some might say we're just at the starting point. So from your mind, from your perception, especially when it relates to coding, where do these models fall short? And where are these tools, I guess, that we have right now, Copilot, Supermaven, everything? Where does that fall short right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of areas related to sort of long-term planning tend to be more challenging for LLMs. So, to use the coding example, because it's what I know. In the coding case, you can imagine there's the kind of situation where it's like, we need to write this function. We want to call some other function to help us out. We've got two candidates. Which other function should we call here to write this code? And LLMs are very good at this sort of thing. But when you get into different kinds of decisions, like, oh, okay, we could pursue this architecture for our project or this other architecture for a project. And they're both going to work, but one of them is going to lead to problems for us 6 months down the line, and one of them is going to be good 6 months down the line. That's the sort of situation where it's more challenging for LLMs because they're not really trained on that sort of thing, right? They're trained to figure out what comes next in the text. And something that requires that sort of like kind of discerning judgment is more challenging. Or, if you're weighing some kind of decision like, oh, do I want to take this job? Do I want to move to this city? Right? I think an LLM is very good at constructing like a pro and con list for each of those options, right? It can line up the benefits and the drawbacks of each option. It's very good at that sort of thing. But once you've got the pros and cons and you're like, okay, well, all right, I know it's on both sides, but what do we actually do? The LLM, I think, is not great at that sort of thing yet.
Like choosing the right path almost. Like it chooses, I mean, it does a lot of choice under the hood, but when it gets to the end of the day, what you're saying is that like when you give it a major decision that has repercussions potentially 5-10 years down the line, or even like a few months down the line, it doesn't cohesively give you a direction that makes sense, right? It just kind of, it'll either just choose one or the other without any kind of consideration for that like time period ahead.
I think that's right. Yeah. And, it's great at retrieving information that would be relevant to making that decision. And it can be very helpful in figuring out what all the factors are that you should consider. But when it comes down to, actually making that call, that's something that I think humans are are better at, and they'll continue to be better at for a while.
Cool. That's an interesting one. I haven't heard that that limitation, but it makes complete sense. Like that is a very human thing to be able to look ahead and short-sighted and ahead, right? Like that duality is very challenging from a machine perspective. It's challenging from a human perspective too, but we are capable of doing it. Cool. Okay, so you run a AI startup right now, right? Like Supermaven is an AI startup. TabNine was an AI startup, technically, maybe not even AI at the beginning, but regardless, curious just from that perspective, what are the challenges you're facing right now? Like how is it the graphics cards? Is it just the models not being fast enough? What are the biggest things that are concerning you?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in AI. It moves very fast. I'd say, one unique thing about an AI business as opposed to a normal software business is, normally when you run a software business, the computers to run and provide your service, they're not necessarily cheap, but they're not usually the main blocker in running your service. If I have a normal software as a service product, right, I'm going to see margins on that of 90% or more because the amount of value you provide to the user is so much greater than the cost of the computers to run the service. But in AI, you have this effect where, when you run the service on a bigger computer and you run a bigger model, that just makes it better. So what that means is that if you want to offer the best service you can, then you need to increase more and more the amount you spend to provide it. And so I think this is one of the biggest challenges for an AI startup is how do I balance, giving people the best experience I can while also making it affordable and having, an option for people who want to use it for free.
Is there any concern with the excitement for AI? I know that sounds weird, but there was a lot of excitement just a year or maybe a year plus ago about cryptocurrencies, right? The value was going nuts. Everyone was going nuts. Web3. It's all we heard about. And then, of course, the crypto value starts to drop. There's a big, for whatever reason, it drops. I don't follow it that closely. And then you hear a lot less about Web3. And it kind of got to a point, Web3 did, where it was starting to sort of touch the actual influencers of just everyday tech, right? Like the actual YouTubers and whomever else, the magazines and stuff, they started to talk about it, even if they're just a general technology sort of place. And that means it's big at that point, right? Once it hits the mainstream media, you're kind of big. And AI is all over the place right now, to the point where if someone's releasing a new laptop, it's like, it has an AI processor, it's an AI, blah, blah, blah. So do you have any fear at all that we're going too big, that people are talking about AI too much, there's too much hype, and it's a bubble that's going to pop? And obviously there's still Web3 stuff happening. Obviously cryptocurrency is still around. So I'm not saying AI is going to disappear, but is that a fear at all for your company if this, I guess, excitement bubble, if you will, do you think it will pop? And if it does pop, is that going to be a challenge for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's definitely going to be ebbs and flows in how interested people are in AI. It's hot right now, and it won't necessarily be hot forever. And there has been quite a lot of investment in AI. I've heard something like 50 billion of investment in AI, mostly in the form of computing hardware. And we're not at 50 billion in revenue in the AI industry yet, but ultimately, there is real value being created here. There is revenue for all these AI services coming from people who use it, every day, coming from big companies that have integrated it into their processes. Copilot has over 1 million users. Those are people who doesn't matter whether they care about AI or are into AI. They just use it because it helps them in their day-to-day work, right? And that's what we're doing. That's our users at Supermaven as well. And I think as long as it's grounded in providing real value to people day to day, then you don't have to worry too much about, ebbs and flows in people's attention.
It's certainly a different situation when you say it like that. Because even myself, I wasn't really on the ChatGPT train. Mike was there much earlier than I was. And then once just Copilot, the sort of consumer one for Windows, came out and started going into Bing Chat and whatever else that they branded it through, that's when I got involved. And then I was like, oh, this is useful. And now it's kind of always there, and I'm always using it on my phone here, there, whatever. I'm trying to get it, on all my devices. And that's not necessarily the case with the cryptocurrency, where it's like if you had a bunch of cryptocurrency and then the bubble popped, now you're like, well, I had a $10,000, now I have $1, right? So how useful is that dollar? But the AI usefulness is a constant unless something goes terribly awry. It's a constant and presumably will keep becoming more useful as it advances.
Yeah, and when you look at crypto, what's the most successful crypto business so far? I think it's got to be either Binance or Tether, right? I was looking at the headlines the other day. I think Tether reported like a $4 billion quarterly profit. Tether, I think, is one of the crypto use cases that has a lot of utility for people day to day. There's a good number of countries where people, transact in Tether every day. And I think crypto and Web3 has that utility as well, but maybe the interest grew much faster than the utility did, and the utility grows more slowly over time.
We're kind of going back to business fundamentals where, we're solving a problem, and hype can kind of cloud that, where everyone's like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. But then hype dies down. And what's left at the end of the day is that utility is that classic, high school business class. If you want to start a business, you got to solve a problem kind of speech you'll get from your high school teacher.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So this next question I'm really interested in. This is like a selfish question, more than anything. You're the creator of TabNine. So you kind of have been through this entire AI run from start, potentially before even AI was a real thing, to now you're the creator of Supermaven, which is a different, it's a similar product, but it's in a different way, right? So I'm interested to see what that progression was like for you, going from creating an autocomplete tool without AI to now using a really amazing models essentially to do some of that work for you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how the capabilities of these models have grown. When I started with TabNine, there was no AI in the product at all. I got started with it. I was at this job, and I won't name the company because I'm going to talk negatively about their tooling. But I was at this job that had a bunch of custom tooling for the technology they would work with every day. And I would be trying to type out some code, and I would press the button to trigger the autocomplete, and the editor would hang for 2 to 3 seconds as it tried to parse all the definitions and figure out what could go there. And I was looking at that, and I'm like, man, I don't actually want this thing to understand the code. I'm just trying to type out this 2-word variable name quicker. I don't know how to write a compiler for this language, but I could write something that can pick out the 2-letter or the 2-word variable that I want to type here. So I made Tab9 to try to just not do anything too smart, right? We never parsed the code. We didn't understand, if you're writing HTML, we didn't understand even what blocks of which div you're in. We didn't understand what div you're in, right? We just know where we are in the code. We know what the current word we're typing is. We know what the previous words were. And that let us be really fast, right? Consistently very fast. So we initially it was just this tool that was supposed to be quick, but then when GPT-2 came out, we already had this tool that was basically the only tool that wasn't specific to a language, right? Because usually these code completion tools, they understand specifically, I'm going to be a Java code completion tool, or I'm going to be a CSS completion tool. And they build a bunch of features that make it useful for that. But we were agnostic to the language, which a lot of people at the time thought was kind of silly. They were like, why would you want that sort of thing? But then we just got really lucky because then GPT-2 came out. And of course, the language models, they're agnostic to the language as well. I mean, they've learned all these languages, but the actual code you use to run one of these language models doesn't matter whether it's JavaScript, CSS, anything else. So we were in the perfect position with Tab9. And so I sold Tab9 back in 2019 because I wanted to go to OpenAI. I was just really excited about working there. I'd say the biggest difference since 2019 is just the models have gotten way better. And they're faster, and they give better suggestions. And that's changed the way people use them. In particular, when we were getting started with Tab9, the idea that the model would be able to write a whole block of code at once and have it be correct seemed kind of silly, right? So we designed the user interface around, okay, we're going to accept one word at a time. We're going to accept maybe up until the end of the line if we're really lucky, right? And then as the models got better, we landed more on the Copilot sort of way to interact with the model, where it gets you a whole block of code at once. And that's also what Supermaven does, because the models have gotten good enough to support that. But they used to be, the models used to be very dumb, and so you were lucky to get 3 words at a time that were correct.
Yeah, I remember those days, and I remember being amazed at even those like 3 words being correct, just because the stuff that came before it was not doing that correctly and was mostly incorrect, or just very like you said, domain specific. But yeah, no, I used Tab9 probably just maybe 2019 or maybe 2020. That was the first time I ever used it. In that, I guess in that transition when you were actually selling it. And then I kind of transitioned to Copilot and then moved on to Supermaven now. So it's cool that I've kind of followed your progression with autocomplete tools, just happenstance. So thank you for providing them.
Yeah, very happy to have you as a Supermaven user. Let me know if you have any feedback after the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then let us know, like anyone that's listening, if you're using Supermaven, let us know if you have any feedback. We can pass it on, or you can reach out directly. Jacob will have all the links in the show notes. Try to get you as much feedback as we possibly can. But yeah. With that, Supermaven's speed and ability to predict based on context kind of puts it at a different level. At least for me, again, like the example that I had was I had like a Prisma schema in my one file, and I was querying that Prisma schema in another file. And this was when I like really got the benefit, I think, of Supermaven more than anything else. It's fast. It's faster than Copilot. No doubt about that. I was okay with waiting the 1 or 2 seconds. It wasn't the biggest deal for me, but I appreciated the speed. But when I opened up my Prisma schema and started writing all of the queries for it, it knew everything that I had in my Prisma schema and was able to predict pretty much everything that I needed to write. So that contextual knowledge across files, and this is in the free version, I want to be clear here, because they were both open. I think that it supports that in the free version, was a thing that kind of blew my mind. Like it increased my query building, 2x, 3x over what I was doing before, right? I'm just curious from your side, how does that workflow differ inside of Supermaven? You don't have to get super technical, but like, was that the intention? Was just like to get more context in so that it's better? How did you combine that? Like, it kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have a really long context window. We have a 300,000 token context window, and for context, Copilot, I believe last I checked, had like a 8,000 token context window. So we're much much longer there. And then besides that, the model also gets to see the diff instead of your current code. So if you've run git diff or you use a git client, it'll show you, in each commit, or you've just seen on GitHub, right? It'll show you for each commit, here's the code that was changed, and that's very useful. In fact, I've heard the advice that when you're getting started with a new code base, right, don't read the code, read the commits, right? Read the ways existing developers are changing the code, because that tends to point you to the parts of the code that are important. And it's the same with the model, is that when it can see the changes you've made recently, it understands sort of what's on your mind now, what we're trying to do right now. Like, are we adding some code here? Are we refactoring this function? Are we deleting this code? Because it knows sort of what you're doing, it can make much better predictions about what you want to do next.
Yeah. Super, super interesting model. Just use it. I mean, that's what I recommend the audience, is just try it out, because again, there is a free version, and the difference is pretty, you could feel it pretty quickly, especially when you start opening different files and connecting the files from one to the other. I really appreciated that. But I think what we're all kind of interested in hearing from your perspective is the kind of topic question, the episode question. With all that we've talked about before, right? These tools are progressing at speeds not seen in technology for probably a decade or two. And I think that's kind of started to worry people, because everyone keeps trying to come out with that thing that replaces them, right? Like, I mean, Devin was a perfect example. They came out and flat out said, like, here's your junior developer, right? Like that was a very clear indication that, hey, you can hire less people. Whether that's correct or not is very much up in the air. And like, I'm very bearish on that, I guess. I don't think that those statements were correct, but we can get into that. And then same thing with like GitHub workspaces that just came out, the Copilot workspaces. It was the same kind of messaging that they were saying as Devin. And again, the example that they provided was kind of a little bit sketchy. And again, I'm not particularly, I don't particularly agree with where they're heading with that as well. But I'm curious to see your thoughts. Like, do you think in the next 5 years, 10 years, these tools are going to have enough of an impact on the industry to really lower the amount of developers that we're hiring?
Yeah. It's always hard to predict like future progress, but I think we're going to get better tools, but they're not going to be able to fully take over the job of a developer, even a junior developer. I think it's a very compelling pitch, right? To be able to go to someone and say, look, this software is going to be able to replace your developers. Developers are very highly paid, right? There's a lot of money in finding a way to have fewer developers. So it's a compelling pitch to middle management. There's a market for that kind of product. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of tools marketed as replacing developers. And then when you actually use the tool, you'll find, oh, hey, this isn't really going to replace developers. It's a useful tool. But it's not a replacement. So what I think you'll find is that you're going to continue to hear people talk about this because it's a great way to sell software. But what the software is going to actually do is not going to quite live up to that promise, even if people are still willing to pay for it. And the reason for that is just that these models they're good at writing code, but they're not great at the higher level planning about what code do we need to write, how should we structure it so that it can be modified, extended in the future. What features are important, what features are not important. A classic thing that programmers do is they look at the requirements, they look at what they've been asked to do, and with their knowledge of what things are actually easy to implement versus hard to implement, they push back on the things that are hard to implement, and they implement things that are easy because the person who gave you those requirements maybe doesn't necessarily know. Maybe these are equally valuable to them, right? But one of them is going to be 2 weeks of work. One of them is going to be 1 day of work. So you do the one that's 1 day of work, and then you push back. You say, do we really need to do this thing that's 2 weeks of work? And I think, if you gave that kind of task to a language model, it would just sort of jump into both tasks and maybe get stuck doing the one that's 2 weeks of work because it doesn't have that sort of sense of when to back out and get a better sense for the overall requirements.
It's an interesting thought. And I think this goes back to what you were saying is the weakness, right? They can't see that like longevity, the length of time that a human can see. And they have trouble with that type of decision making. And I think you're right. Like, I don't know what the solution to that is. Like, I don't think we have the technology right now to be able to get to that point. And all with what you're saying, both those points kind of together, that gives me a good foundation to understand why we're not going to be replaced for a little while longer, at least, which is huge.
Yeah. The reason, the progress in recent years has been really rapid, right? There's been a lot of progress in the past 5 years, even in the past 1 year, right? And that's why people are concerned. They see this rate of progress and they say, okay, well, if this keeps up, like, where are we going to be in 5 years, right? And I think that's very reasonable. But the progress that we've seen recently is really a result of scaling these two objectives that people train models on. One is, to predict the next token or the next word in a bunch of internet text and code. And then one is, they call it reinforcement learning from human feedback. And what that means is, you have the model generate two answers to a question. Then you show those answers to a human, and you have the human rate, which one was the better answer. And then use that process to improve the model's the model's generation of answers to make them, more factual, more helpful, and so on. And I think in order to get past these problems with existing LLMs, it's not a matter of scaling these objectives further. We would need to find new objectives. It's really an open research question. And there's stuff we know is going to happen for sure, right? The models are going to get bigger. GPT-5 is going to come out someday. I don't know when that day will be, but when it comes out, it's going to get facts wrong less often. It's going to be more factual. It's going to be better at writing code, right? But it's still trained on these same two objectives, right? And so there are still going to be some things that will require human judgment, and that's not going to change.
I was actually going to ask, based on the limitations, from the outsider looking in, more or less the consumer perspective. I remember years ago, and I'm doing this from memory, so some of this might be incorrect, but when Google was first really showing off Assistant, and they were really trying to push all their smart home tech, they came out on stage at, I think it was a Google I/O or some sort of presentation, and they, obviously did this sort of marketing spiel. But then if you watched the prolonged conversations, there was talk about how they were trying to program neurons and stuff, and a whole bunch of very AI, whoa, this thing is going to be the next big thing. Now that tech has sort of, I don't know if it's plateaued or whatever, but now we're on LLMs. My question is kind of stemmed from that. So, we see there's a limitation with LLMs, and this question may not be possible to predict right now, but are LLMs just the AI we're going to have, and we're just going to keep progressing it? Or is LLMs just, another step, and then in the future it'll be something else that aren't even LLMs at all that are our AI? Yeah,
that's a good question. It's so hard to predict this stuff. I think LLMs they're very good at what they're good at, right? There's all these classes of problem that were just completely solved by LLMs. I think they're going to be around for a while, and whatever future system we have is either LLMs are going to be a component of it, or they're going to be successors of it. You think about when you're trying to predict the future, right? I think often a good way to think about it is, okay, what would I have predicted 10 years ago, and how would that have played out given what actually happened? So you look at AI 10 years ago, that's 2014. Language models were not really popular back then. They didn't really work that well. They mostly said gibberish back then. The big thing back then was deep reinforcement learning and convolutional nets. So how does that compare to LLMs? Well, it's not exactly the same. LLMs are different models, but the seeds are there, right? These convolutional nets are built on a ton of data, right? It used to be high quality data. You use an approach that scales well with data, that scales well with having, a bigger computer. I think those elements are never going to go away. And if LLMs do get replaced at some point, it's going to be by something that shares those characteristics, right? It's going to benefit from having a ton of data. It's going to benefit from having big computers. Beyond that, I don't know. It's really hard to say.
The sort of combo tech angle is kind of interesting, because I could almost think of it in a way as an LLM might intake if we were to put it into some sort of humanoid robot or something, and we humans start interacting with the robot, it could take that, translate it down to sort of our dumb assistants, right? Because the dumb assistants are very good at turning on lights, turning on radio, doing whatever. It translates it down to that. Then that does the sort of one-off task, move leg or turn on light or whatever. So it'd be interesting to see how they sort of build on each other or replace each other, or how it's going to be. Because like you said, it's the future. I mean, we're not in the Jetsons future that was predicted so many years ago. So, and we're very far from the Jetsons future. It's not happening tomorrow. So
that's right. Yeah, I'm very optimistic about robotics progress in the next 10 years, actually. And the reason is, if you look at these modern video models like Sora, right, they have, an excellent understanding of physics in the real world. They know more or less how objects in the real world move around and behave, and the knowledge is there. And so I think it's just a question of, how do we hook that knowledge up to a robot so that it can actually act in the world? And that's a very, very challenging question. It's not easy, but the capability is there. We can see it in the video model, and someone's going to figure it out because there's a lot of people working on it.
Skynet is coming, confirmed.
yeah, that's it. They're coming to get us. Cool. That's awesome, Jacob. I really appreciate you coming on. I think, unless, Matt, you have any other questions, we can kind of roll out the red carpet for you, Jacob. If you have anything you want to plug, anything you want to talk about, we'll throw all the links that you talk about in the show notes. I already have a few in there right now, but yeah, floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah, you should try the Supermaven free tier. It's free. And we have a pro version that's even better. So just give it a shot and let me know if you have any feedback.
Awesome. Really appreciate you coming on again. And yeah, hopefully everyone tries it out and lets us know what they think.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Great talking to you. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that interview as much as we did, but it is time to end. And before we do so, remember that you can support the show by using our Patreon. That is patreon.com/HTML, all the things. Check out the tiers and give that a go. And you can also use our Scrimba affiliate link. Link will be in the show description as well as on HTMLallthethings.com in the show notes for this episode. And before we end, we'd like to thank our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, who is a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.